So, since a lot of you have asked me to explain past perfect a bit, I thought I would do that. So, let's start off with past perfect simple. Now, it's a tense that you will rarely see on its own because it's usually used in combination with simple past. This has multiple reasons which we'll talk about later. But first, let's talk about how the tense is actually formed. So it's quite easy and quite simple. It's much like present perfect, except you have had instead of have. But the basic formation is you have had plus the past participle, which in simple terms is the third form of the verb. Here you can see how the statements, the negatives, and the questions are formed in the past perfect simple. The statement is, when we arrived at the cinema, the film had already started. Now, obviously, had and started are the two main parts that you have to pay attention to here. Already and when, they are in green. They are signal words or time adverbs. These will help you identify which tense you have to use. And the orange is the simple past, because as I've mentioned, you will not have past perfect on its own. You will probably have it in combination with simple past. The negative form is, when we arrived at the cinema, the film had not started yet. Had not started is going to be our negative, and the question is, had the film already started by the time you arrived at the cinema? Had and started you can see here, and the subject comes in between the two parts of the sentence, had and started, the two parts of the construction, and this is how present perfect works as well, so it should be quite familiar. In Hungarian, this tense has a really easy to understand name. It's called előidejűség, which basically means that you have to look at, you will always have two actions, and you have to look at which of these two actions happened first. This is its first function, to put two events that happened in the past into a chronological order. So you have two events, you want to say which one happened first, and the first event that had happened will be put in the past perfect, and the second event that happened later will be put in the simple past. Its other function is to use it like present perfect, but for events that happened entirely in the past. How that looks or how that works is explained here. You have past perfect, which says he had not been to Italy until he was 6. Now, this puts everything that we want to say entirely in the past. In present perfect is a bit dissimilar, is a bit different, because with present perfect you would say he has not been to Italy yet. The main difference is with present perfect, the action or the state that we are talking about started in the past and continues up until the present or has an effect on the present. In past perfect, however, the event that we are talking about started in the distant past, and it changed or had not changed until another point in the past. So the main point with past perfect is that everything is in the past. So an event started in the distant past and it had an effect or continued up until another point in the past. Okay, so everything is in the past. With present perfect, it has a relation to the present. With past perfect, it doesn't have a relation to the present at all. Now, as I usually present to you, there are some signal words that are useful to recognize if you want to be able to use or you want to be able to solve tasks efficiently regarding the past perfect. Here you can see the words themselves, and you can see an example with each of these signal words. I marked with green. I marked the words with green. I mean the signal words with green. I bolded the past perfect forms, and I marked the simple past forms with orange. This should help you get around and this should help you recognize everything that you need to recognize. I will not explain these. I think that these are quite self-explanatory. The main point is that if you see one of these, you can suspect that you will, need to use past perfect if you have a story that's entirely set in the past. Because you have to be careful with the fact that once, not yet, never, just, for, after, before, already, these are also signal words of present perfect. So you always have to keep in mind when the thing or when the event that you're talking about or when the story that you're telling is taking place. Is it entirely in the past? Because if so, these will be signal words for the past perfect. If your story or your or whatever you're talking about has a relationship with the present, then it's going to be signal words for the present perfect. Now, let's move on. For those who are a bit more visual, you have this explanation. But before we move on to that, I just like to emphasize that everything is completely in the past. There is either a reference point, a time in the past. For example, by the time I was 12, it's a reference point that happened entirely in the past. Or there is a second past event that happened later, and these will be in the simple past. So to explain this, we have this sentence: he had never eaten shark meat before he visited Greece. You have the first event, never having eaten shark meat. This is this event continues up until the point in the past when he visited Greece. So this was like when he was born until the point he visited Greece. Okay? And the other part with the simple past, we can explain it by using this sentence: she started cooking as soon as her brother had left. So the first event that happened was her brother leaving. He had left, and after he had left, she started cooking. So the first event is her brother leaving. The second event is her starting to cook. You can see these little diagrams here. To explain this further, what you have here are two events. Event number 2 you can see here, and event number 1 you can see here. Event number 2 is the event that happens later. It's closer to the present, and event number 2 will be in the simple past. Event number 1 happened in the distant past. It's further away from the present, and this will be in the past perfect. So the first event here is her brother had left, and the second event is she started cooking. Her starting the cooking is the second event. Or we can also have this here. When we arrived at the cinema, the film had already started. So as you can tell, you can mix up the clauses however you want. You can have the simple past in the first clause and the past perfect in the second clause, and you can see the arrows pointing there. So when we arrived at the cinema, this happened later in the past, so this is closer to the present. This is going to be in the simple past because it's the second event. The first event that had happened was the film starting, because the film had already started by the time they got to the cinema. So the film starting is the first event. This is further away from the present. This happened earlier than they arriving. So the earlier event is basically to express that an event happened earlier, you use the past perfect. I think that's plenty of explanation, but if you still have any further questions, then don't hesitate to ask. And now let's move on to the continuous form of the past perfect continuous. Basically, we have two use cases here. The first use case is when you talk about an action that started in the past and continued up to another point of time in the past. So you have an event happening that you have an event that had been happening for a while. It starts in the distant past and continues up until another point in the past. So we are still completely in the past, but here our main point is that something had been happening for a period of time, until another point in the past. To look at an example, we have this sentence. I had been waiting for Susan for 2 hours when she arrived. So we have the green part here, tells us for how long this event had been taking place. We have the past perfect continuous to signify, the past perfect to signify that this event happened first. Me waiting happened first. She arriving happened second. And we have the ing form, waiting, to signify that this event had been going on for a period of time, for 2 hours. This can be any time period. You might even omit this time period, or saying what the time period was, but it's usually helpful, and it's usually how it's done. So it's usually written in the sentence. So I had been waiting for Susan for 2 hours when she arrived. The waiting was the first thing, arriving was the second thing. So the first thing is obviously in the past perfect, the second thing is obviously in the simple past. And we use the continuous because we know that it had been happening for a certain time period. It started taking place in the distant past, which is number 1, and it continued up until another point in the past. We can of course change the clauses around. By the time the cab arrived, so this is the second event, we had been standing in the rain for 30 minutes. So obviously we had been standing is the earlier event. We have the time here, so we need the continuous. And the second event is that the cab arrived, and you can see some signal words here that help you get around, basically. The second use case for past perfect continuous is to signify or to mark or to to show you that there is a causal connection between two past actions. So action number 1, which is in the distant past, has a relationship to action number 2, which is in the closer past. And of course the first event is going to be in the past perfect, the second event is going to be in the simple past. So I was thirsty because I had been working in the sun all day. The first action that had taken place is obviously me working in the sun all day, and the second is being thirsty. So because I had been working all day in the sun, I was thirsty later. So the first event is this one, the working, and the consequence is the being thirsty. It's in the simple past. Once again, you can change the clauses around. It had been raining for hours, so the pavement was wet. The first event is the rain. It had been raining for hours, and the second event was the pavement becoming wet. So because it had been raining for hours, the pavement became wet. Basically, the consequence of the rain is the pavement becoming wet. But once again, the important part is that everything is in the past, everything is in relation to the past. So you have to take that into account. Nothing is in the present, everything is in the past, everything is a closed, complete action. You don't have to worry about the present. As you might be able to tell, this is very similar to present perfect, but once again I would like to emphasize that the difference is that in the present perfect it has a relationship to the present. In the past perfect, everything's in the past. You can see the formation of present perfect continuous here. You have had plus been plus the ing form of the verb. This doesn't change, so it's always been, it's always the ing form of the verb, and it's always had, so it's not very difficult to form. The statement is I had been standing there for hours before they came. Had been standing, had been plus the ing form of the verb. And of course, as always, we have a simple past after it, or usually we have a simple past after it, because in order to use the past perfect, you have to have a reference point that's either something in the simple past or a time in the past. And you also have to have something that basically allows you to use the continuous form. You have to emphasize that an event that took place had been happening for a long time. So for hours is basically what you want to have in order to have a continuous tense, or something that signifies that the action had been taking place for a long time, for an extended period of time, or that it was something temporary. The negative is I had not been standing there, so not too difficult. I had, and then you have not been standing, so it's sort of the same, you just have a not, or I hadn't been standing there, obviously. And for the question, had you been standing there for hours, again, the subject comes in between the had and the been. Had you been standing there for hours? Quite simple stuff. So to sum up, the main takeaway is that you always have to decide which of the two actions happened first. This can be past perfect or past perfect continuous, doesn't matter. The first action will be in the past perfect or the past perfect continuous, alright? So the event that happened first, the event that is further from our present. The second action will be in the simple past. That's the event that's closer to our present. That's the event that happened later. And as I've already emphasized it, there's a difference between the past perfect and the present perfect, and it's that the present perfect is an action or a state that started in the past and continues up until the present. So again, I would like to emphasize that it has a relationship to the present. The past perfect is an action or a state that started in the distant past, so a past that's very far away from our present, and it continued up until a certain point in the past. So everything is in the past. The main event is in the past, or the first event is in the past, or the starting point is in the past, and the ending point is in the past as well. It's present perfect. The starting point is in the past, but the ending point is in the present. So I would like to keep these in mind. Now, thank you for watching and have a nice day, and I hope this helped you clear up any confusion. And as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. So thank you.